Logical to try to go and memorize all of the pathways and steps of metabolism, but it is logical to focus on the logic of metabolism. So today, metabolic logic part 2. Yesterday we talked about how ATP gets its power. Today, let's talk about how we use that power and how we regulate that power. How we use ATP and AMP and ADP and regulate their levels and use their levels in order to control other things, and how we stock up when we're running low, all that cool stuff. So let's go. We get more power because we have a higher concentration of ATP. But this also means that when we go and we use ATP, the amount of our fuel decreases, the fuel itself loses its potency. So as we get closer to that equilibrium, basically the amount of energy that we get released by burning ATP, it actually decreases. The fuel loses its potency. So our cells need to be able to keep a high ATP ADP, and as we'll see, ATP AMP ratio in order to keep it so that that delta G is going to be very negative. So if we want to actually be able to use ATP for like doing stuff, we're going to have to keep making more of it. And it turns out that when we're making it more favorable to break down ATP, we're making it less favorable to make ATP. We're making it harder and harder to make more ATP as we make more ATP. Because remember that if something is favorable in the forward direction, it's unfavorable in the reverse direction. The more favorable it is in the forward direction, the less favorable it is in the reverse direction. And so if we want to go and to take this reaction in reverse, we want to actually take ADP and add a phosphate group to get ATP. Well, that's going to be really, really hard. How hard is it going to actually be? Well, under these conditions, it would be 11.6 kilocalories per mole positive. You'd have to put in that much energy in order to make ATP. And so our cells have to go through like a lot of work constantly making more ATP in order to keep up. Because, and it's really important that you keep these levels steady, going back to our idea of steady state, we want these cells to be able to have a constant supply of ATP. We're going to need to, if we want to use that ATP, we're going to need to keep making ATP. And if we want to keep that drive hot for the power of ATP, we need to make a lot of ATP. And if we want to do that, then basically we're going to need a lot of energy in order to make more ATP. And so our cells are going to keep ATP high, but not too high, because if you have it too high, well, then it's going to be going off all over the place, and it's even harder to make more. And so what we're going to do is basically we're going to have a fairly constant level of ATP that's going to be ideal, and it's going to be far from equilibrium. So we're far favoring the ATP over the others. And then basically we can kind of monitor the ratios and to know like whether we want to break down molecules or make molecules. We'll see how we can have all sorts of layers of regulation based on molecules, like based on enzymes and things being regulated either directly by ATP, by phosphorylation, by ADP, by AMP, all these various ways in order to kind of keep that supply at a level that you want. And so, but how do you go about and you actually make ATP? How do we do that reverse? How do we do the ADP plus phosphate equals the ATP? Well, this is going to happen in the electron transport chain primarily. And so this is that end of the line for our cellular respiration. We've taken those electrons from those good energy sources like those sugars. We've transferred those electrons. We've done a bunch of oxidation reactions, transfer those electrons onto these carrier molecules, NAD plus and FADH. And then what we've done is we've basically taken them and we've taken those electrons into the mitochondria. We're using them to the power of those electrons moving from something with a lower potential, from something that wants the electrons less to something that wants the electrons more, and finally getting to oxygen, which is like wants the electrons more than like anything in the world. This oxygen really wants the electrons. And so this drive of those electrons through this is going to power this pump that's going to power the making of ATP. And we'll talk a lot more about how this happens, but it's a long process to get there. There's a bunch of steps. And so what if you need ATP in a pinch? So what that was doing, what we were looking with the ATP here, basically we were making ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. Remember, just like a free-floating phosphate. But we can also make ATP from ADP. And so this is the job of this kinase called adenylate kinase. So remember, a kinase adds phosphate groups. And basically what this kinase is doing is what it's going to do is it's going to take two ADPs and make ATP and AMP. So remember, our goal here is we want to make ATP right at this point. So remember, before what we had was we had ATP was getting hydrolyzed to give us ADP plus PI. But really, this is going to be way, way favored in this direction because we stack the decks and because it's inherently more favorable. And so now we're saying, okay, well, doing this direction is going to be hard. And so we're going to have to go through all of that, those fancy tricks in order to do it. But what we can do is basically, what if we remove this? If we remove this, well, what's going to happen? There's a couple things that are going to happen. One is that we're going to basically make the reaction even more favorable in the positive direction, which is going to benefit the breakdown of ATP, which is not what we wanted. So we wouldn't want to use this strategy for long, but what we can actually do is we can take two of those ADPs and we can use them to make more ATP with this adenylate kinase. So we take these two ADPs and we make ATP plus AMP. So we're able to make our ATP, but we're also making it harder to make more ATP in the traditional way. And so basically, this is going to help save us, though, like in a pinch. And it's also important for allowing us to kind of stack the ratio of ATP to AMP in order to basically have a better sensor of changes in levels. It turned out that the concentration of AMP is a more sensitive indicator than the concentration of ATP about the relative amounts of energy in your cells. Basically, what happens is that because we keep the concentration of ATP so high, small little changes in it aren't going to have a big relative change. So if we say start with a concentration of ATP that was 5 millimolar, and then we use up 0.5 millimolar, so that would be a 10% relative change. But if we converted that 0.5 millimolar into giving us AMP, so what would happen there is basically we go from having 0.1 millimolar of AMP, since we normally don't have that much, to 0.6 millimolar, which is going to be a 600% change. And so by basically having molecules that respond to the concentration of AMP, we're able to basically can help regulate the making of more energy. And so we can see that basically if our AMP goes up compared to our ATP, then what's going to happen is we're going to need to go and we'll want to make more ATP. And so this is, but if we go the other direction, we're going to want to make less ATP. So there's this protein called AMP activated protein kinase, AMPK, that we'll talk more about. And basically what it's able to do is it responds to a decrease in the ATP AMP ratio by phosphorylating key proteins and regulating their activities. And the end result of this is that it's going to lead to higher concentration of ATP and lower concentration of AMP. So your AMP goes up. What's going to happen is that this is going to activate the AMPK, which is going to increase the glucose transport and activate glycolysis and fatty acid oxidation. So basically, it's doing all that stuff to make more ATP. And then it's also going to suppress the energy requiring processes such as synthesis of glycogen, fatty acids, cholesterol, and protein. And we'll talk more about this. But this kinase is really cool because it's able to kind of make changes that are going to affect both the make more, and the break more. And then once that AMP goes down, well, now it's basically able to kind of allow things to get made again. But our muscles also have another way to get energy on the fly. And so basically what's going to happen is that there's this molecule called creatine, and it's actually an amino acid, but it's not one of our alpha amino acids like we use in our protein making, but it does have a amino group and a carboxylic acid group. And what can happen is this kinase called creatine kinase, or CK. It can take, when ATP levels are high, it can take ATP and it can transfer a phosphate group onto creatine to give you phosphocreatine. And so this is going to be favorable when those ATP levels are high, when your reactants are high, when they're higher than you would have at equilibrium, you're going to be driving to the right, making more phosphocreatine. But now what's going to happen is when ATP levels are low, it gets transferred back to ADP to make more ATP. And so basically, we talked about with the ATP hydrolysis and stuff, how its power came from being far from equilibrium. And we started with a very negative delta G. So even we were always going to be favorable unless we had a ton of like basically really crazy amounts of our ADP and stuff. But if we have a reaction that's kind of more on the fence, well, now we're able to kind of respond better to changes in the concentrations. And so by having a reaction like that of creatine kinase that can kind of go back and forth more easily, then we're able to respond better to changes in concentrations. And so we can say, like, if we have high ATP, let's go ahead and make phosphocreatine. And then if things get low, if we need more ATP, we've got that phosphocreatine. And now basically we'll have more of our products than reactants that would be wanted at equilibrium. And so now we're going to go the other direction, because we're adding or removing our reactants, controlling the rates, controlling the direction of this. So you also, though, like, you have to actually make or eat more creatine, because these can also non-enzymatically convert into a molecule called creatinine. So you might have heard of that. Basically, your kidneys filter it into your urine, so you pee it out. But if your kidneys are having problems, then it doesn't gets like peed out and stuff, so doctors can check creatine levels to see if all is okay with them. And creatine itself is made from like amino acids, and it's cool, but I'm not going to go into that. So your cells are able to have different levels of ATP and ADP and AMP and creatine and all these stuff. So the concentrations of all these are going to vary from cell to cell, depending on what types of stuff that they need to be doing. And so you can see that, like, in a muscle cell, they have a lot of ATP, and they have a lot of the phosphocreatine. So they're stocked up in case they need to do things. But in something like a neuron, well, here you're going to have a blood cell. In a blood cell, basically an erythrocyte, they have a lower concentration of ATP. They don't need to be doing all that energy making stuff, and so they have lower concentrations of these, none of the phosphocreatine. And by having, like, controlling these levels, our bodies, like we saw with that kinase, they were able to kind of control different molecules, like allosterically often, by having ATP or AMP or ADP kind of bind to part of the enzyme, get it to change shape, change its activity, so it goes from being more or less active and things like this. And this is going to help us respond to levels of ATP and ADP in order to know, like, okay, well, there's plenty of energy around, let's go ahead and let's make some stuff. Or, oh, dude, don't use up all our ATP, we're running low. So maybe we should actually start breaking down sugar. And so we'll talk much more about this regulation and the different pathways. But first, a few cool stats on ATP. This is from this book, For the Love of Enzymes, The Odyssey of a Biochemist by Arthur Kornberg, which is really great. Basically, an intake of 2,500 calories, which is actually a kilocalorie, but like when we have it on the food labels and stuff, it says calories, but those are really kilocalories. That corresponds to the turnover of about 400 pounds of ATP. Your body only holds about 50 grams of ATP at a time. So in order to reach that 180 kilograms, it has to be constantly turning it over. So that 50 grams gets turned over about 4,000 times per day. And if we go and we calculate based on moles and stuff, that's about 6 times 10 to the 22nd ATP molecules. So that 50 grams of ATP is about 66 trillion molecules of ATP. So on average, like the last phosphate, that gamma one, gets taken off and added back on 3 times per minute. So we were talking about ATP hydrolysis. So like taking ATP and adding water, and voila, we get ADP and inorganic phosphate. But typically that's not what happens. Instead, what happens is that the ATP is going to get transferred in a series of steps and not by it's rather than just getting hydrolyzed. So in the first step, what we typically have is that we transfer one part of the ATP molecule to a substrate molecule or an amino acid residue, and this is going to activate it. And so then once it's activated, then what can happen is that you get displacement of the phosphate-containing moiety, generating PI, PPI, or AMP as a leaving group. And so by doing this, what you're basically able to do is you're adding a better leaving group. And so we can't just go directly from like glutamate to glutamine, like the amine group, like attacking. That wouldn't make a good leaving group if what it's kicking off is an OH minus. But if instead we can take the energy, we can transfer a phosphate group from ATP onto here. Well, now what we're doing is basically we're making a site that is then going to be easier to displace, because if we displace this phosphate group, well, now we've got this resonance stabilized thing and all is going to be happy. So ATP can donate phosphoryl groups. So that would be phosphoryl is basically just these 3 oxygens on a phosphate. And so with this phosphoryl, basically, because it's not an actual phosphate, if it was a phosphate, it would actually be transferring all 4 oxygens. But what we see is that basically one of the oxygens is going to be from the original attacker. And so you're transferring a phosphoryl group. You can also attack, so that was if you attacked the gamma position. So we can talk about like ATP as having this 3 phosphates, alpha, beta, and gamma. The gamma is the farthest one. And if you take that, you're transferring a phosphoryl group. And this is like what kinases do. If you attack the middle phosphates, that beta position, you're going to transfer a pyrophosphyl group, and you're going to end up with an AMP left over. So here we ended up with an ADP left over. Here we ended up with an AMP left over. And here, if we attack this first position, well, now what we're doing is we're actually transferring this whole AMP group, and we're getting left over this PPI, this pyrophosphate. And so these interactions, basically, they're taking place like SN2 reactions, where that phosphate is going to be a really good electrophile because those oxygens are pulling electrons away from it, making that phosphate really electrophilic and vulnerable to attack. And then this is going to, once you have that added on, well, now it's going to be a great way for you to like modify molecules. So with a kinase, what we're doing is basically we're attacking that gamma position, that last phosphate, and adding a phosphoryl group. And this is really great because then what can happen is you're adding this like negatively charged group. You can get molecules. You can make a better leaving group. You can modify the action of enzymes you can add binding sites, all these various things by having this modification that you couldn't put on, that wouldn't be possible without having without having a kinase. So it's not like you couldn't add it directly when you're making the protein. Instead, it's a post-translational modification, and it can be added by kinase and removed by phosphatases. We also see that we will do things like use ATP in order to allow us to join together molecules. So like amino acyl tRNA synthetases, basically they're responsible for actually putting amino acids on the transfer RNAs in order to bring the right amino acid to the ribosome. How this happens is basically you're going to, instead of directly adding the amino acid to the tRNA, which again, there's not a good leaving group, you would have to kick off an OH minus, which would not be a good leaving group. But if what you can do is you can basically instead first attack the ATP, now you can basically lose this ATP this phosphate containing group that's then going to be a good leaving group. This is going to be a great leaving group, this AMP. So if you transfer the AMP on first, and then you can attack it more readily, you can basically get a better leaving group, and this is going to be a favorable reaction. Even though overall, you're basically spending energy, you're spending that ATP in order to make it happen. And one of the great things about when you're adding AMP is basically you get this pyrophosphate, which itself can get hydrolyzed to give you orthophosphate. So there's a really common enzyme, it's like everywhere, and it'll do this hydrolysis. And this is going to be super duper favorable. You increase the resonance and you increase the entropy, hydration, all of that good stuff. This is super duper favorable. And in fact, if you go and you take ATP, you generate AMP and that pyrophosphate. That gives you a minus 10.9 kilocalories per mole. So it's even more than we would get if we just took off a single phosphate group. But now we can actually go and we can take that pyrophosphate and we can go and we hydrolyze that. Well, now we get another a minus 4 kilocalories per mole. So we're like stacking up, we're adding lots of this. And so this is going to basically be a great way that cells can do things like stabilize intermediates that really need a lot of stabilization. And so we'll see things like this in like lipid metabolism as well as our amino acid charging. You can also see like DNA polymerase and DNA ligase, some various examples of how we're using ATP. We're using the energy of the ATP in order to drive reactions. And in generating intermediates, this is another common thing where you have basically you're transferring part of the ATP onto a molecule and using that as a kind of like way to make the reaction more favorable. And just a little side note, basically, just a complicating factor is that instead of being a free floating in our cells, ATP is always hanging out with like magnesium to keep those phosphate groups from repelling one another. Although, and this can really complicate calculations and stuff, so typically we just kind of ignore it. So phosphate groups, as we mentioned, they have those, they got that good resonance that can go on, they can get good hydration and this sort of things. It's not just ATP that's able to do this. So there are other like high energy phosphate groups or whatever. Basically, it's not just ATP is the bottom line. But ATP is kind of like this universal currency that if all these enzymes are able to, all these molecules are able to use it, then it makes sense to like, once you specialize in one thing, why change? But we will see that like GMP is going to be used for various reactions, as well as once we put a phosphate group from ATP onto something else, well, now we have something that can have an even greater free energy. Like look at this phosphoenolpyruvate that we'll look at. It's like a minus 14.8 kilocalories per mole. And so that's going to be like even more favorable than our ATP. It's really important that ATP occupies this sort of like intermediate between these like quote unquote higher energy phosphate compounds and those lower ones. This is going to make it so that we can actually make it. Like if ATP was like the highest energy, it would be really hard to actually go and make it. But by having things like these phosphoenolpyruvate with this really big negative delta G, this minus 14.8 kilocalories per mole, by having that, well, now we have a way where we can actually go and charge up that ADP without having to go through the whole electron transport chain. And so we'll see how the bulk of our ATP making is going to happen through that electron transport chain and how we can basically siphon all of these electrons from all these various pathways into there. But along the way, we're actually going to be making ATP, such as in glycolysis, such as using that phosphoenolpyruvate in its high energy phosphate bond in order to directly phosphorylate ADP to give you ATP. So we're able to make ATP without having to go through the electron transport chain, without having to go to an energetic, have oxygen present. And so this is how you can get like fermentation and stuff going, and you can use that to make energy without the electron transport chain. But then the big problem with that is actually regenerating the NADH, the NAD. And so we'll talk more about that. But bottom line is ATP kind of like is in this kind of like intermediate zone, so that it is able to get the phosphate group from higher energy things like the phosphoenolpyruvate, like the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, like our phosphocreatine, and then donate it to other molecules. And this is going to help us power reactions. By having this ATP ratio so like stocked up where we have so much of our ATP, and then by having it like so that the reactions are going to be like, we have all these molecules that want to use ATP. Well, in this way, we're basically making it so that we're kind of relying on ATP for life. So let's talk about for a minute about this idea of kind of like energy coupling. So imagine that you have an inherently unfavorable reaction. So basically you've got your delta G, something like that. You've got your curve, something like this, where you're going to have your reactants at a much lower energy than your products. Now, no matter how great an enzyme is, only it's going to be able to do is lower that. So that's not going to be enough, especially because then you have to consider that if it lowers that activation barrier, then when you go and you make products, you're more quickly going to go and make reactants again. So remember that the enzyme is only going to can only affect the speed and not the direction. The speed at which you reach equilibrium, but not the direction of the equilibrium, not what's going to the concentrations when you reach equilibrium. So that's not going to work. Using an enzyme won't work. But what if we could do something where we're going to be generating a lot of energy in order to start with? And so what if we take a reaction? What if we take something where we're going to start up here and go, well, now it's going to give us enough energy to power that reaction. And so kind of like how on a roller coaster, you spend a lot of energy to go up that first one, and then you can go. So if we spend energy to make ATP, then we can use that energy from ATP. We can use it to power these other reactions, which on their own would have been unfavorable. And so this is kind of the idea of reaction coupling, is you can use a favorable reaction to drive an unfavorable one. And you can use reactions to kind of give and take intermediates in order to like pull away the products so that they drives the reaction forward even further. So there's all sorts of different strategies that can be used to kind of give energy and manipulate the levels so that things are favorable. So one of the first places we'll see this is, well, the first step in glycolysis. And so remember, glycolysis, the breakdown of sugars, the first step of it is actually going to be phosphorylating glucose by hexokinase to give you glucose 6-phosphate. This is important for a number of reasons, including trapping that glucose inside of the cell so that it can't get back out, and it's trapped. But this is going to take energy. If we were to just go and take glucose and inorganic phosphate and try to combine them, this would tell you that we had a positive 3.3 kilocal per mole change in free energy. But what if we couple that to something that's favorable? Then we can basically get enough energy to get over this. And so this is what we could do. We could couple it to the hydrolysis of ATP. We saw that with hydrolysis of ATP, we could get about 7.3 kilocalories per mole released. And what if we use that in order to drive the making of the G6P? Turns out we can do this. So remember, delta G is a state function. It just depends on the beginning and the end. And so we can get there and we can end there. We can go in between in all sorts of different ways. And as long as we kind of have everything cancel out, we're actually able to directly add these standard free energy changes. So in this case, we could take the standard free energy change of a positive reaction and then do the negative reaction. And then overall, you could get a reaction that's going to be energetically favorable. So yes, we had to put in energy to make that ATP, but then once we've gotten the ATP, well, now we can use it to drive reactions that are not going to be energetically favorable on their own. And so this is going to be what we see here. And so in this example, basically what we have is we have glucose plus inorganic phosphate goes to glucose 6-phosphate. If we want to make this more favorable, How can we do that? Well, we can think about like increasing the concentration of our inorganic phosphate. Increasing the concentration of the reactants is going to drive things towards products. And so how could we do that? Well, we can do that by breaking down ATP. So we can have ATP goes to ADP plus our PI, and then that PI gets used by our glucose to make our glucose 6-phosphate. And in this way, we're able to use the power from the ATP in order to power this process. So what we could do is we could go and we can actually add together those standard free energies. So remember, our phosphate groups are going to cancel out. And so what we're going to end up with is basically we can write an overall equation. Glucose plus ATP is going to go to G6P plus ADP. And now we can actually just add together those standard free energies because we've accounted for everything in this equation. And so go ahead and do that. What would be the standard free energy change for this overall reaction? So delta G naught prime is equal to minus 4.0 kilocalories per mole. So we took this reaction that would have been unfavorable, and now we've made it so that we can favor it in that forward direction. It's not as favorable if we're just burning that ATP, but it is favorable. And so it's much more favorable than if we didn't have it go through this pathway. And so so basically, although we can write it as having that inorganic phosphate, what's actually happening is that you get those phosphate groups transferred from ATP directly rather than just from a free-floating phosphate. Okay, so we could add the standard free energy changes, but it turns out that equilibrium constants, so we're like our KEQs, these are going to be multiplicative. So the KEQ for the overall reaction is the product of the individual KEQ values for the two reactions. So what are the KEQ equations for our various things? So remember that for a KEQ, it's equal to products over reactants. So that would be our G6P over glucose. And remember, we multiply these, so times inorganic phosphate. And for the ATP equals ADP, this is the one we've done over and over again earlier, times PI over our ATP. And if we think about this overall reaction, what we would have is we would have G6P times ADP over glucose times ATP. And remember that these are the concentrations at equilibrium. And so what is the KEQ for these various reactions? Now, given that we know we're given the delta G naught prime, basically, if we plug those into the equation, what we get is that for this first reaction, it's about 3.8 times 10 to the minus 3. Makes sense, we're less than 1. We know that's an unfavorable reaction. But then for the ATP to ADP plus PI, here we get a positive 2.3 times 10 to the 5th. And remember, when we get bigger than 1 KEQ, that's going to be telling us that we have a favorable reaction, which we know. So what is the KEQ for our overall reaction? Well, there are a couple of ways that we could do this. One is that we can multiply together those individual KEQs and to get a value of 8.7 times 10 to the second. So remember that this would be saying that we would have about 870 times more of our products than our reactants if this reached equilibrium. We could also have gotten it directly from calculating KEQ, given the delta G that we found for the overall thing was going to be minus 4. So to review, Some reactions are going to be inherently energetically unfavorable. They'll have a positive delta G naught prime, which remember is going to be saying, like, if we were to start with standard conditions, so we have 1 molar, we have equal concentrations of our products and reactants, and we let them go to equilibrium, assuming that we have long enough time to wait in the absence of any enzymes or anything. We come back, we'll find more of our products and reactants if it's favorable, or we'll find more of our reactants than products if it's unfavorable. So in the case of an unfavorable reaction, we'd find more of our reactants than our products. But what if we want to form those products? Well, we could stock up on more of the reactants, use Le Chatelier's principle to drive things to the right, but then we're going to do a couple things. One is we're going to make it even harder to go in the reverse direction, because if you make the forward direction more favorable, you're also making the reverse direction harder. And then you could have crazy concentrations of things, and it still might not even be enough to get over that bump. Now, enzymes can only do so much because they're going to catalyze the forward and the reverse directions. They can lower the activation barrier, but they can't change the difference in free energy between your starting and your finishing products, that delta G naught prime. And so basically what's going to happen, though, is that because that delta G naught prime, because the overall change in free energy is going to be a state function, what you can do is you can actually couple reactions together. So you could take a non-favorable reaction and couple it to a favorable reaction. And as long as that favorable reaction has enough energy that you need for the unfavorable one, well, now what you can do is you can combine them. If they share a common intermediate, you can combine them in order to use the energy from the favorable reaction to power the unfavorable reaction. Now, sometimes what we want to do is we want to have reactions that are going to be very energetically favorable, so energetically favorable that it's basically irreversible. So although nothing is actually technically irreversible, there are some reactions that we consider basically irreversible because the change in free energy is so great that you can't really easily go backwards. And so we're going to see a few examples of these, which are going to serve as important like regulatory points through metabolic pathways, because you can imagine that if you can control those like go or no-go points, those points of no return, well, then you can basically control the whole thing. But what can happen then is that you're making it harder to go in reverse. So typically what we're going to see with metabolic pathways is that there are often going to be a lot of steps that are reversible, steps that have like similar, that are running at like near equilibrium conditions. Under these conditions, small changes in the concentration of your reactants or your products can lead to a big change. It can lead to like what direction things are going to go. Because remember that the actual J a reaction goes doesn't just depend on that delta G naught prime, it depends on the actual concentrations. The comparison between our KEQ, so our equilibrium concentration ratio, and the actual ratio at the present moment, the Q. And so if you have a Q that is going to be less than your KEQ, then you need to make more products. But if you have a Q that's going to be greater than your KEQ, you're going to go backwards to reactants. And so by controlling the levels of the reactants and products, you can control the direction of the reaction. But it still has to be able to overcome that delta G naught prime. And so by having reactions that are kind of running closer to that tipping point, you're able to go back and forth easily. And then by having these reactions that are running far from equilibrium, here basically what we're able to do is we're able to control the direction of the reaction and can have a go or no go point. And then if we want to go backwards, so if we want to, instead of doing glycolysis, breaking down sugar, we want to do gluconeogenesis, go the other direction, then often we'll take a different route to go over those steps with those big change in free energy. But for these other steps, we can more easily go back and forth between them. And we can do that by changing the levels of our reactants and our products. But if we want those big changes in free energy, and if we need to do something that's really energetically unfavorable, typically what we're going to do is we're going to turn to ATP, or we're going to turn to some other quote unquote high energy compound. Remember that it's not the actual breaking of the ATP that is causing this energetic boost. It's always going to be endergonic. You're going to have to put in a little a little energy in order to break a bond. Because remember that whole enthalpy thing, where we're going to get energy if we make a bond. So we have to use energy to break a bond. But then we get bonds to water with hydration. We get things like resonance stabilization. So there are ways in which this ATP like using this ATP is going to be inherently favorable. But typically we're not just like burning it right as is. Instead, we're transferring ATP. So we can transfer from either of the 3 phosphate positions, and this is going to allow us to have a nice leaving group. So we're going to see it activate various parts of reactions, make great leaving groups for when we do our SN2 type reactions. And so we're going to see a lot of examples of this when we talk about different metabolic pathways. And I don't want you to get tied up in trying to memorize all of these pathways or all these intermediates, but I do want you to kind of take a look and see how the phosphate groups and how similar things are being used in order to facilitate reactions. But remember that the big power of ATP isn't just from that inherent favorability, it's also from the fact that we keep its concentrations out of skew, so that we have such a higher concentration of our ATP compared to our ADP and our AMP and stuff. And this is going to then allow it to have a higher potency. We can also monitor the ratio of AMP and ATP in order to have an idea, get a sense of how things are going in a cell. Do we have more energy? Do we need more energy? And then by using ATP, not only as an energy source, but also as a regulatory molecule, by having things like phosphorylation control the activity of enzymes, by having ATP and AMP and ADP act to allosterically modify various enzymes, we have all these ways where we can use ATP in other ways in order to control things like the making of more ATP. And so remember that metabolism, it's not just these straight arrows. It's not simple pathways. Instead, what we're going to have is we're going to have that complex system where things are going in all sorts of directions, and it can get really overwhelming, but you shouldn't try to memorize things. Instead, we're just going to kind of look at the connections, look at what's happening, look at the logic. And that's what I really care about you guys focusing on, is not trying to memorize all those pathways. Please, please, please don't try to memorize all those pathways. Instead, let's think about the logic, and we'll do some exercises and things like this to try to get at what's going on at the deeper level. Because if you can understand that logic, well, then you can apply it to all these different pathways. So don't get intimidated. We're going to have fun.